Greetings, one and all. This is Christopher Cohen coming to you from QA Wolf. Welcome back to Wolfed, the podcast where we dive deep into the strategies of engineering leaders to uncover their secrets to success. On today's episode, getting the most out of individual contributors and teams, when to stay on top of issues and when to create space, and how to keep tabs on the happenings across the entirety of a large organization. This is just a glimpse into the discussion I had with our guest, Eric Schvimmer. That's the Executive Vice President of Technology and CTO at Bloomberg Industry Group. Eric was generous enough to share his time with us, offering invaluable insights into how he stayed agile and found success throughout his illustrious career. Thank you so much for joining me today, Eric.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. I'm very excited to have you here. And, I want to start by hearing a bit about how you first started down your path. So first thing I'd love to know from you is, what was your first exposure to software engineering?
That actually, and if you look at me, you can tell I'm not exactly a spring chicken. That goes back to high school. And maybe the dawn of the computer age. We're not talking like, the nice little ENIAC computers, but not too far away. I was fortunate in that I went to high school in Fairfax County, Virginia, which at the time was a pretty progressive school system, and they brought computers into the schools pretty quickly. I learned to program in BASIC at first, and then we had a nice little HP Mini that we did some other programming on. I guess it might have been BASIC as well, BASIC or Fortran. So I got exposure pretty early on. It was something that kind of felt fun. Never thought it was going to turn into a career at that point, but yeah.
Right. And it's sort of exactly my next question, which is like, when did that gap get crossed of like, okay, this is fun, this is interesting, to, hey, I actually want to do this for the rest of my life, or at least be involved?
Well, this is a funny story of, call it opportunity or laziness, depending on which way you want to look at it. So I went to college, and my original intent was to become a meteorologist. So I got to the school, and into my first semester there, they canceled the program. So I could either go find another school or just change my major. So obviously I was kind of lazy in this fact I didn't really want to change schools. So I just changed my major, and I'm like, okay, let's look down the course catalog. Remember those things back in the day. This computer thing looks pretty interesting. I had some fun with it. Let's do that. And that's kind of how it happened. I wish it was something more storeful than that. But that's what it was.
And so from there, did you go right into taking that education and starting to work in the industry as a developer?
Yeah, my degree is in management information systems, and that's sort of a combination between business and software development, which, back in the day, most people were doing the hardline CS thing. But I always had an interest in business and how they worked and achieving success. So I kind of thought that was a nice marriage for me. And the other focus was more in that track. We, at the time, again, God almighty, this is going to date me. If you went the CS route, you're dealing with assembler and Pascal. Raise your hand if you've ever seen any Pascal programs in your lifetime. None.
Keeping my hand down.
At least you've heard of assembler. If I went down the business route, we were learning things more along the lines of, there's one that you'll never hear again, RPG, but more importantly, COBOL, which at the time was the rage. And I hear the state of New Jersey is still looking for folks to program in it. So yeah. So there's always job security here.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So that's that's sort of why I went down that path. And yes, to answer your question more directly, I came out of school with a degree and wanting to program. From there, I joined what was at the time, but it was, at the time, what was a startup, a company called MCI Telecommunications. For those of you not of that era, they were challenging the big long distance foe called AT&T. They were the startup upstart, and that's how I got into it.
So what does that look like then, from being what maybe we'll think of as like a low level developer or just like an IC, to your first leadership role? Were there key events along the way that sort of shaped your path towards leadership?
Yeah. So along the way, I worked at MCI for a little while, then moved on and worked for a government contractor. And, especially, if you're in Washington, you can't you're gonna end up doing some work with the government some point or another, and you're either gonna love it or not. Um, we'll save judgments on all that for another time. But so I did that, and one of my roles, and it was fairly early in my career, I was a technical team leader for a particular project, and that was kind of fun, right? I got to make some decisions, take ownership, and help people get stuff done. So that was my first taste of it, and that kind of whetted my appetite. But I was really mostly a developer for quite some time. If I'm to put some dates to all this, probably stayed as a developer until about 12 years or so, 10, 12 years, developer of some sort. Along the way, I also got experience on the infrastructure side, doing a little bit of network engineering, et cetera. So I got a bunch of different experiences along the way.
Yeah, and so I imagine, as you're stepping into those an early leadership role, there's probably a lot to learn. It's probably a lot different than being an IC. What works, some of maybe your biggest takeaways from those early leadership roles versus maybe what are some of the big mistakes you made that shaped how you think about being an engineering leader moving forward?
Whew. Well, here's the thing I would say to anybody who's about to become an engineering leader: you're going to make mistakes. Nobody I ever met has not. I made all the classic ones. So the challenge, the good news was I had a good technical background going into all this, both from the software development side and the infrastructure side. The bad news is I think I knew too much at some level, and you start to micromanage, do too much yourself, don't empower your employees. So, I didn't get the multiplier effect of the people I was managing. So, there are so many mistakes. And sometimes you're also, the callousness of youth comes out too, thinking you know everything. And then the other piece is not understanding how important relationships are to your success. But that's all part of the learning.
Definitely. I mean, does one or two things stand out in your mind as like a pivotal moment for you where you thought, okay, I'll either never do this again, or I've learned such from this that I've got to change how I strategize moving forward?
So many, but the first one that comes to my mind is when I first started managing managers, because there's one thing managing people, then managing managers. And I remember the first time I was doing that, and I pretty much kneecapped one of my managers in front of a bunch of people. And I saw the look on his face, and I'm like, oh boy, that was not good. And that I vowed to myself then, I don't know that I was 100% successful, but I had to change my ways. Just
Gotcha.
because I know something and I think I'm right, you don't call out people in front of in a room. You do it privately.
Yeah, that's probably a good call, but I guess I could see how like that's something that maybe you have to experience before you really solidify that as part of your practice, right?
Nowadays we all think about, you know, servant leadership, et cetera, and it's sort of in the vocabulary. Back then, well, not so much. It was a different way, but I realized that the best way to get the most out of people is to give them freedom and also create a zone of safety so that they can fail and not worry about looking over their shoulder. Because if people feel like they don't have that zone of safety, you're not going to get much in the way of innovation. You're going to get very risk averse people. And as a business, that'll kill you.
That makes a lot of sense. And yeah, you mentioned that like early on, maybe you weren't as comfortable with giving such autonomy to your team. I mean, and of course, that's still got to be a difficult balance, striking that where do we draw that line between autonomy and between collaboration in your own engineering team? Do you have any major takeaways or rules of thumb for how you can kind of ride that line?
I don't know that there's any rules of thumb. I think in your own organization what are the things that you can take chances on, and what are the things that will make sure they get a new leader. And so you kind of got to balance that. And ideally, when you see things starting to go off the rail, there's some times where you can just know that let them fail because the consequences, you're not flying an airplane, right? The world's not going to come to an end. And it's the best way to learn, to be honest. There's others where you know that that's going to have repercussions that go way beyond or have material impact to the bottom line of the organization. And those are ones you're going to want to stay close to. And the other thing I think you teach your leaders too, and with doing that is if you're on top of things, I'm going to stay away from you. But if you're not, I'm going to ask some questions and you got to answer them. So if you want me out of your hair, stay on top of things. That's
Do
the
your job better.
same. Well, it's just no, I don't want to do that. I got other things to do. But
Exactly.
especially in key projects, um, I want to give them enough freedom to do what they need to do. But I think another strategy I found that works really well is I do deep dives, skip level ones with my teams, generally a few times a year. And that's a chance for the individual contributors to tell me what's going on. And often you learn quite a lot from that. Things that come out that people don't necessarily give to you. You're going to get filtered information, but um, or they're afraid to tell their bosses this. And it may not be the people, nobody's deceiving you. It's just, hey, they don't feel comfortable talking to their boss for whatever reason. So those are really good strategies to understand the challenges that are at the individual contributor level, as well as within major projects. But for major projects and for major functional areas, um, I try to at least, we talked about the individual contributors, but even the first line managers, I try to meet with them at least a few times a year directly, and I'll let their boss be in the room. And there's no secrets
Hmm.
here. Just for them to give me an update on the things they think. I don't even have an agenda. I let them create the agenda. They talk about it.
Wow. Yeah. And in fact, I mean, it makes me wonder about how when you've got such large teams under you, or trees of large teams under you, like how do you balance your direct availability when managing all that? I mean, how much do things like mentorship and development still play a role in your position nowadays?
So if the natural inclination or the natural, what's the right way, momentum would be, you're going to meet with your peers, you're going to meet with your directs. And if you're not careful, you're going to really insulate yourself. And that's when you get in trouble at so many levels. And so I really try to make an effort to break out of that and talk to individuals at both my clients' organizations, in a few levels down from my peers, so that I know a little more about what the real concerns are, but also within my organization so that I can get a better sense of what's happening. Now, look, you got to balance things. You don't listen to every single thing that comes your way, or you validate them, but it's invaluable. Now, to your point of mentorship, that's a huge thing for me. I wouldn't be where I am if it weren't for the help of some folks along the way. And I feel like I need to give back in that. And so I try to do that as much as I can. Matter of fact, we have a formal program in our organization. Before you can become a manager, we put you through a program called mentorship. And it's a structured program based on really a framework that the parent company, Bloomberg itself, developed, and takes you through several topics. Um, and the goal is to make you, don't just throw you out to the wolves and make you learn the hard way like some of us went through. Talk through some of the things you are likely to encounter, and here are strategies to deal with it. And it involves discussing these things as well as reading a lot of good books. We start off with Camille Fourier's A Manager's Path, which, by the way, if you haven't read that, it's a great thing if you're thinking about getting into engineering leadership, so that you know what you're signing up for. And it talks about the different stages. And so we start there and make our way through various different books, including How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie, which is an excellent book on how to develop relationships. Even though it's written
Absolutely.
back in like the 20s, everything about it is still relevant today. And so those are the things we do. And so to your point, um, I still am doing some mentorship at our manager level. I just took on one, started the first class last week. And
Awesome.
I enjoy that. It's a chance to help shape the engineering organization. And also, if people see that I'm doing it in my organization, they'll know that it's a part of their job too. Because everybody likes, yeah, mentorship. Yeah, I want to be a mentor. You can come listen to me. But it's work and you need to do it. But the only way we get better is if we all contribute.
I think that's so important and such a great point. I mean, obviously, leading by example in any regard is a great strategy, but especially in the tech industry where being a tech leader can be so difficult, so dynamic. It's great that folks like
A
yourself
lot of us
are
aren't that
making
good
it a
at it, to
priority.
be honest with you.
Yeah, well, that's why we're chatting about it, right? It's certainly one of the more dynamic and difficult things to try and do well in the tech industry.
But
So
I say that somewhat in jest, but as I look around, and by the way, I don't consider myself a great leader. I'm working on this every day. I make mistakes. The minute you start thinking you don't, that's when you are in trouble. But I look around the organization as a whole, and this isn't the only place I've ever worked. Good leaders are hard to find, and good leaders are ones that listen. You don't necessarily do what you ask, but they listen to you and they give you feedback. They assist in removing roadblocks, and they celebrate victories, and they help make the team better. Those are the things that I think are really key. And the other thing is they don't talk stuff that they have to act the way they talk. If you don't do that, you lose all credibility.
so true. Absolutely. We spoke a little bit about, some of your early leadership roles. Could you tell me a little bit about the moments that shaped your path towards becoming, your current role at Bloomberg Industry Group? What got you involved with Bloomberg, and you've been there for a while now? Like, what did that look like to get you where you are now?
I thought you were going to ask me a different question. So if we want to talk about how I got to Bloomberg, it was purely coincidental. I was at AOL at the time, and Tim Armstrong had just come in and taken over leadership of the organization, and we were going through a bunch of transition. I was running the AOL media organization at the time, and we were about to go through a pretty massive downsizing, and right thing to do, because in the end, what Tim did saved the business, but that's no fun. And it just so happens that my wife ran into a friend who happened to be pretty high up in the Bloomberg organization and said they were looking for a leader in the DC area. And, the two things came together, clicked, and I ended up building out. And at the time, Bloomberg didn't have any engineering in this area. I was employee number one, engineering employee number one here, and built up our organization in this area.
Wow, that's amazing. What was that like, being on the ground floor of that? I'm sure there had to be
tons
of challenges scaling.
Bloomberg's an interesting, we're very engineering focused organization, but they're also one that has grown mostly organically over time. And so bringing in an outside leader, not something they do very much. And there's a little bit of suspicion. It's almost like going through the mafia and getting a hazing of sorts. But once they figured out that I kind of embellished maybe embellish isn't the right word, but I have the same values that they had, things changed, and that made me part of the organization as opposed to an outsider. And so that was, it's almost like you're going through your rite of passage and proving to them that you're someone who wants to do the right thing, will stand up. And one of the key values at Bloomberg, and this is one of the reasons I love the organization, we want engineers, but we want engineers that are not only good engineers, but are wanting to understand the problems they're solving. I was encouraged from the first day I got there pretty much to make sure I get put on sales calls, go out and talk to customers, so I understand a lot of what our business partners are asking for, so that it's not that I'm validating it, but often things get lost in translation, and you want to make sure you're not building a faster horse. You understand the real problem you're trying to solve. And the other thing that I love about Bloomberg is, it's a Wall Street firm, but there's bad things with it, but there's a lot of good things with it. And that a lot of these firms thrive on respectful confrontation, because that gets you to the best possible idea. If you are thin of skin, some of these things are not good, but for those who can be comfortable with themselves and respectfully confront your peers, it's a great thing, because ultimately you get to the best ideas, and often it's not mine. It's whatever the other person, and you see it, right? But I love that. I love the fact, the other thing I loved was, you enter a new organization, any large organization, you got a lot to learn. And what really makes a difference is, are there people willing to help you? And I never had an occasion where, and off when I first got there, I knew nobody really other than my manager, who was an excellent networker and knew a lot of people. But you develop internal networks. But the first thing you find out who's responsible for what. You just go over to their desk, pick up the phone. Remember that little thing that we used to have on our desk, or just get on a chat and just ask the question. And almost never would anybody ever turn me down. And the only reason they would is just because they're so busy and they got back to me when they could. So people want you to be successful, and that's a great atmosphere.
Yeah, absolutely. Such an important culture to have for promoting growth and progress.
Yeah.
So for being on the ground floor of the engineering org there, I mean, what would you do differently maybe now that you've done this already? You've scaled this from just yourself to the team it is today. What have you learned from it, and what might you change if you were to do it again?
Well, so what's ironic is I've had 3 different roles in Bloomberg since I've been there. So what would I do differently? So there was a point when I first took over this one product line, since I was engineer number one and we had very aggressive deadlines, we were really relying on outside contractors to do things because it was the only way to get it done. I remember probably 2 years into my tenure, one of the most difficult decisions was when to say that it's time for us to take over. Because our business partner, they had a roadmap they wanted to see completed, and it was not timid. I knew long term the right thing was for us to become the majority and for them to start to become the minority. And the question is always, when do you do it? And you're putting your head on the line and taking a risk when you do, because if it fails, well, guess who? But there's a saying, there's no right way to do the wrong thing. And so I remember agonizing the night before the meeting with that business lead. And I knew what I wanted to do, but I kept questioning whether it was the right thing. But somehow my inner, whatever you want to call it, compass said, do it. We did it. It was a fun conversation. But once I did it, there was no looking back. It was execution mode. And we were successful. It was a great thing. It was the right move. I don't look back on that.
And so
but I do remember I was scared of it when I had that conversation.
But something in your gut told you it was the right call. I mean, do you find that that's an instinct that's served you throughout your career? Do you often trust just your gut to make those kinds of decisions?
Well, the good thing about getting older is you've seen a lot. And so you don't have to do as many of those things, but your moral compass usually is right. Unless you're immoral, but most people aren't. And so, just go with what you think is the right thing. And I keep coming back to that saying I said earlier, like, there's no right way to do the wrong thing. If you think it's wrong, don't do it.
And you've also mentioned, I mean, being surrounded by people who aren't willing to, or who are willing to challenge you respectfully. And maybe, that way, if you are perhaps on the wrong path,
you got to listen too, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Keep those ears open. Right. Okay. So, I mean, we're talking a lot about leadership, being an engineering leader. I kind of want to take a step back from that for a second and just pick your brain a little bit about what that specifically means to you. How do you define leadership in the context of engineering and technology, and what qualities do you think are essential for being an effective leader in this field?
So I think I think for you to be a really effective leader, you got to be somewhat technical, and at least have the aptitude. I don't know half the things my team's coding these days, but I can figure out, if I had to, I could figure out what they're doing. Especially now in the days of LLMs, I actually can now write Python, and I've never learned a line of Python in my life. But having intellectual curiosity and understanding how systems and components work together. I have not used a modern object-oriented language. I haven't done that much, but I know what it is to do it. And understanding that, and I think the other benefit for me, is that I've pretty much done at some point or another in my career at most jobs that are in an engineering organization. So whether it's working on a help desk, network engineer, sysadmin, or developer, I know those roles. I know some of the things you're up against. And I think that helps me quite a bit. And I think that gets respect. Now, you don't need to know all this stuff, and you don't need to know, hey, how do you write the best JavaScript code? But, I think
Yeah.
that helps you quite a bit. And I think the other thing, though, that helps you is you got to listen. And that's no matter what leader you are, engineering or not, because you're not, I haven't met anybody yet who's 100% right. And if you're lucky, you're sort of more than 50. And so listen and, also challenge yourself with the phrase, what if I'm wrong? Right.
Yeah, I love that. Have you found in your experience that people who are in a position of leadership in the tech industry, but maybe don't have that hands-on technical experience, struggle?
I think they do. I think they struggle in two ways. One, inevitably, there's going to be a difference of opinion on your teams as to which way you want to go, and somebody's got to break the tie. So either you're going to have to delegate that to somebody, or you want to feel confident that you're making the right call. Two, I think you lose some respect to the team, and that translates into number three. People want to work for people who they think they can learn from. And so, there's that old thing, B's hire C's. You want to really if you're going to build a really top flight organization, you've got to start with good technologists. There's no way around that, right? And they want to work where they're going to learn something. And that's the other thing too, that we haven't touched on, but probably is a key attribute, is you got to create an environment where there's learning expected. Because the only thing that I can tell you for sure is that what we're doing now is going to change. And how we do it's going to change. And well, I'm actually very certain of that. And so if you're going to have a successful career in this industry, you're going to have to pivot at least a few times. I think I've pivoted probably about 5 in the different technologies that more than that probably, but you get the point.
Yeah.
And so learning is a part of your job. It is part of it. And part of it is, hey, yeah, given time, but the other part's in you. You've got to have an intellectual curiosity, the desire to want to learn it, right? When LLMs first came out, I was just like, how can I learn more? I knew it was a big deal. Well, and especially when ChatGPT got released in November, like 23, 22, that just sort of opened my eyes. So I've been like voracious in understanding how they work. Do I know everything? Hell no. But you need to understand a lot about it so that you can direct it. And especially something like that, a new technology where you as a leader are expected to help shepherd the organization through it. If you don't understand how it works, I don't know how you can help guide the organization.
It's a great point. I mean, absolutely. And I think this idea of pivoting or like constantly learning and needing that intellectual curiosity to succeed, that there is such a focus so often on deadlines and deliverables, but at the same time, we need to be in a position where we can foster innovation and know what does the next thing look like and what is that next step, and like you said, be ready to pivot. So how do we balance those two things in your experience? How do you foster innovation
Oh,
while
that's
still
always
maintaining a focus?
that's an ongoing challenge. So at the end of the day, we have deadlines we have to deliver, right? But we got to also stop thinking that engineering is an organization that's a factory, right? We're not just a factory. There is a lot of art to what we do. And in order for you to get the best out of people, we've got to give people some free time to do some experimentation, create that opportunity or zone for failure, as long as we're failing differently each time, and learn and foster a culture of learning. One of our goals in my organization, if we have every engineer has a goal called accelerate learning. Actually, every manager has that. I think that's what we ended up calling it for every individual contributor. And that the notion is we want you learning something every year that's relevant to your job. And yeah, how do I create separation? The way I try to do it at a high level is that I tell our teams and our engineering leaders, nobody should be booked 100% ever. There's 70% for project work, 30% for KTLO/other stuff. And that's where we try to take it out of.
Tell me KTLO. I'm not familiar.
Keep the lights on, like operational
Gotcha.
activities, software. It's all these types of things like, yeah, like version upgrades, everything, the things that nobody wants to do until they bite you in the butt.
So for these individuals that you bring into your team, and like you said, there's so many different qualities that someone needs to have to truly be successful. What kind of strategies do you employ to attract and retain that kind of talent when it's such a competitive job market for skilled engineers?
So there's a bunch of different things we try to do. One is what I just talked about is, people want, if you're looking at dollars that you get paid, I'm not going to be the top place because, we're a privately held company. We don't have stock. We're competitive, but what I create is an environment where a few things exist that I think most of us want. One is that you're creating something that's actually going to get used, and that it's meaningful. Two, you're part of the solution. You're not just a short order cook responding to somebody's wants and needs. And three, you're going to be able to grow your skill base. So those are things that we do to try to attract and retain people. And we're also trying to strike a healthy balance between people who are experienced and people who are early in the career. And I think there's all sorts of benefits for having that kind of diversity.
Yeah, absolutely. New perspectives from fresh eyes, but also some of the old hats who've been around the block.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, somebody's got to mentor them. You can't just go all young and
right.
The callous. I've been young before. I know what the thing. We get very overconfident. So yeah, you need somebody to show you the ropes.
Gotcha. I guess maybe then the other side of this question is, and I don't know how much of this plays a role in your current position, but how do you know when someone's not the right fit for your team, and how do you approach that when it comes to the conversation about, well, this isn't working out?
That's always so much fun.
The most fun.
There's certain things, right, where sometimes it's the situation, sometimes, it's how they respond to feedback, or the fact that they just don't even realize it, because sometimes they don't, and even though you point it out to them. But if you see the same pattern over and over again, you're not doing anybody any good by continuing down that path, right? And the thing that I see the most is when people don't have that conversation.
Just at all, just kind of and you're saying like maybe it's like not the right fit, but it's too tough to have the conversation, so it just kind of stays.
Right, and so the worst thing that happens is when people ignore it.
Yeah, because then
and then the person thinks they're doing exactly what you're being told, and then hey, the performance review comes, and you see this all the time. Oh, this is the first time I've ever seen this in my performance review. Why aren't I getting a good raise? Right. And yeah, people hate having that conversation. I hate having it, but you're not doing anybody any good by putting it off.
It's so true. I mean, I wouldn't want to meet the person who loves having that conversation. That's probably, but like you said, I think it plays right into, healthy communication, healthy confrontation. This is, of course, the ultimate example of an instance like that. And you're right. I mean, better to have the conversation than not, of course, for the good of the team and the good of the individual. Is that, would you agree?
Yeah. At the end of the day, our first responsibility is success to the business. That's goal one. But I also want to look out for the individual. And make sure that we're growing their career. And sometimes I'm growing it for somewhere else. We may not have the role for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. And right, I don't think you're doing anyone any favors by keeping them in a position they're not a good fit for.
Yeah, and so there's certain lines you cross where you know that it's time. And sometimes it's a situation. It may not even be the person, right? Once somebody is, I've had a couple of occasions where they're good people. They made a mistake or two. They were big ones. But they're in a position where no matter what they do, they're not going to get a fair shake. And sometimes, again, you're not doing anybody any good by not having that conversation and letting them know that.
Absolutely.
That's the hardest one. Those are the hardest ones where you to me.
Yeah, that's rough. But like you said, at the end of the day, it's got to happen, right? Better than not.
Yeah, because it's, and especially the other thing that I've found about this is most of the time the team knows when you have a poor performer. And if they see you don't deal with it, that brings the rest of the team down because there's no incentive for them to do the right thing either.
So it can have an effect on morale too.
Yeah.
Something that struck me about your work experience and even at Bloomberg is that you've had a lot of experience working with distributed teams. And now, of course, in a post-COVID world, distributed teams are much more common. But it's from what I've seen of your history, you were sort of ahead of the game there and working with distributed teams for a long time now. How do you feel about in-person work versus remote work in general, and sort of the entire conversation that's happening in the industry right now about best practices there?
I think it's going to depend on the company and the culture, and how they work. Look, I know people who do really well being able to have totally remote teams, and I've had teams in offshore locations. I still have them. And there's certain strategies you can do to make that work more effectively versus not. They need to own something, because if they don't own something completely within that team, then they're working cross geographies. That's tough. But to answer your question more directly, I think there's an element of in-person work. I can see all the nice little hashtag OK Boomer going right now. That does make sense. Now, does it have to be 5 days a week? No. But especially when we're mentoring people new, it's tough to do that remotely effectively. I can tell you our turnover rate during the people we hired during the pandemic is higher than people either before or after. Again, doesn't have to be. I think my answer to your question is I think hybrid is the right answer.
Hybrid.
Where teams are in and for some amount of time together. And the reason there's both within the engineering organization, but also with the product organization, because there's a lot of stuff where you're just sitting there whiteboarding things that's hard to replace electronically and remotely. But, it's not, I can't sit here and tell you one versus the other. And I think it also depends on the organization and its culture.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, did you find, especially early on with your early experiences with remote work and especially with offshore teams, that there were big road bumps kind of getting things up and running, or managing those teams from long distance? Or what did that look like?
Oh, yeah. Trying to think, what was the first experience? I think the first experience was dealing with some teams that were located, and at the time it was at AOL, and we had some teams that were we owned the center. It was a center in Bangalore, and they were smart people, but we weren't getting what we should have out of them. And why was that? Well, one, they were being treated as not equal, as inferior folks because they're in India. And, some of the engineers in our headquarters location were conceited, for lack of a better word, and saying, they're inferior to us. So they didn't consider them part of the team. And, people react to how they're treated. So you get what you put in. And so I think that was the first thing. The other, and one of the best classes I ever took, is to understand cultural differences, because I think people underestimate some of that stuff. I think we had a great class at AOL on how to work with folks of Indian descent and how they think differently. They're raised as kids very differently. And once you understand that, you can work so much better with them. And it's also kind of a metaphor for life, right? Try to understand. Most people are not crazy, believe it or not. There's a reason behind why they're acting the way they're acting.
And so getting to that method is going to help you work better.
You just need to understand why and help address that concern.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Kind of pivoting to a different direction here. In your experience, what do you think are some of the most common bottlenecks or challenges that engineering teams face during the development process, and how have you addressed them? Or what do you think are some of the best practices there?
So I think the thing that we as leaders, especially the higher up you go, underappreciate is how much bull crap we put in their way. Um, I don't think we appreciate the friction, whether it's, certain security practices or, and some of them we have to, but also impediments in environments. We do a survey. We try to do it every few months. And the whole notion of what we're trying to find out is things that we don't understand and then address it. And I try to read those. The comments are the best part of it, right? And that's painful because it's time consuming to read. But looking at that, and then the other thing, if you're going to do a survey, don't just do a survey. You got to do something with it.
Actually take that feedback, consume it, internalize it, make changes if you're hearing the same feedback over and over.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
I guess one more kind of question, sort of related. It's, as an engineering team is pointed in a certain direction and you guys are iterating on a process or an initiative, how do you kind of stay aligned with the expectations or the needs of your customers or your end users? And how do you kind of get that information to the engineering team?
So, that goes back to, fortunately, we work in an organization where we believe that, the engineers aren't bottled up in the back room. We want to talk to customers with our product peers. We like to do it together and then brainstorm on the problem, not necessarily what they're telling us, but that's, I think, the best part of how we understand the customer need.
So engineers are very much involved in those conversations, huh?
Yeah, try to. Not every engineer, but yeah.
Yeah.
We want, and the other thing is, this is all basic. Let's not try to boil the ocean at once. Most of the time, our hypotheses about things are going to be wrong. The key to success is figuring out where you're wrong early and then pivoting. So get stuff out, iterations, learn, and whenever possible, get things in production to customers so that we can learn from them, because I can tell you my opinion and you can tell me yours, but that doesn't really mean crap until we actually get it in their hands.
Absolutely. Something else that kind of I think about a lot, especially now in the tech industry and in a post-COVID world, is this idea of work-life balance, which I think means something different to everybody. But how do you think about work-life balance? How has it been throughout your career personally, and what measures do you take to kind of ensure a healthy balance within your own team?
So, yeah, there are more things to life than work. But some people, that is their thing that drives them. I have a lot of different hobbies, so that's kind of helped me. I have kids, that will definitely help you for one way or another. I think the most prescient saying that somebody told me right before I had kids was, "You don't know how much free time you have." And well, yeah, I found out. Not anymore. So you got to be more effective with it. And at the end of the day, I think it's healthy to take a break. I see people who work all through the night, et cetera, then come in the next morning, man, it's going to burn you out.
Yeah.
You're not going to be effective. I actually think I'm more effective because I try to shut everything off, and sometimes more successful than others. Ideally, when I walk out the door, but no more than maybe, an hour at home. I don't get too hung up on checking email messages. What I found, honest, and when I go on vacation, I delegate to somebody, and I don't look at it until I get back, because that's not a vacation.
Totally.
And we're all replaceable at the end of the day, whether we think we are or not. And it also helps build a better organization, because if I'm always looking over everybody's shoulder when I delegate to people, what's the point? And then the other thing I try to do is I don't want to send emails to people after hours. I try not to do that. I definitely try not to send them on weekends. And sometimes I use the weekends for catching up. But, there's a nice little delay till later send feature. Use it. Send it Sunday night or Monday morning so that people don't feel like they have to work just because you're trying to catch up.
So it sounds like, maybe another way that you're leading by example here. It sounds like by doing that, you're sort of setting the standard for the folks under you in terms of like, hey, it's okay to set these boundaries. It's okay to be disciplined.
But there's times when the fire alarm rings, we got to go down the pole and we got to respond. But let's make sure they're real, and that's not every day. So
Exactly.
That's the way, because I think what you're really getting to is what's a sustainable pace, and we really got to get to we can't run the engineering teams full throttle all day, or else, people will burn out and leave. And finding good talent's hard. And that's the other thing too, right? When you as a leader, the thing I underappreciate sometimes, I underappreciate a lot, but is your position power. Because you think of yourself, I'm still the same person I used to be 30 years ago, but you're not, for better or worse. And people, when you say something, they're like, whoa, what the hell just happened here? And so when you ask somebody to do something, if it's not important, make sure you tell them that, because they're going to try to please you and do it right away. And I make sure that, I try to tell people, like, we really don't need this until next week. So don't kill yourself. Let's save emergencies for when they actually are needed.
That's great. Yeah, I think that's such important communication. We mentioned a little bit, you spoke about ChatGPT and those kinds of technologies briefly. Are there any other, or maybe you want to speak a little bit more to these sorts of emerging technology trends that you think will have the biggest impact on the future of business and the tech industry?
That's the most immediate one at the moment. I'm sure there's other things, and I've kind of watched a few waves of these, but what's amazing to me about this one is how quickly it's caught on. I think, we talk about what it might do for the way we work in general. What I think may be underappreciated is how it's going to change the role of how we do software engineering. And if you've not played with GitHub Copilot, you should, or Amazon Whisper or something of its ilk. The fact that I told you earlier, I can code a Python program, and I've never written a line of code in that Python. That's amazing to me. So I think now it's gotten some people like all afraid, shit, what's going to happen to my job?
Right.
I'm subscribed to the theory. Last I looked, there's a very huge deficit of software engineers to jobs. So even if it's, let's use a number, cuts it by 50%, which I think is actually very aggressive, I still think most of us will have jobs. But what I think it's going to do is put a premium on engineers who understand the full stack and how things work. Because
go ahead.
These models aren't perfect. They do get things wrong. You have to look.
Right.
And you're going to people need to do the integration and troubleshooting. And when that happens, you need to have the full skill set. You're not going to be able to get away with just knowing a small piece of the world. So I just think the nature of our work is going to change, but I do see it as it's going to be a huge change in how we do things. What are the things that software engineers hate doing the most? There's two, actually: testing and documentation. This, I think, has potential to take care of a lot of those burdens. Not all of them. So, you all at QA Wolf know that better than anybody. We need to start comforting people. Don't look over your shoulder. Don't fight it. Let's embrace it, become practitioners of it, because that's going to put you one leg up on everybody else. A few years ago, the big thing was, hey, moving to the cloud. And it's not because if you're doing it just to save money versus running your own data center, you're doing it for the wrong reasons. And you usually don't save any money. You may even actually cost yourself some. The real reason is to brace two different paradigms. One is the notion that infrastructure is not a pet, right? It's cattle. So that you can create more sustainable systems because they are able to recover and be scripted and automated all the way through and through. And the other is, let's use services rather than running our own infrastructure wherever possible. You're not going to get kudos for running a great infrastructure. It's expected. It's dial tone. You are going to get kudos for focusing your resources on creating better applications. Hate to say that, but that's the reality of the world.
I would totally agree. And yeah, I really, I'm, so grateful for your time, Eric, as we've kind of touched on some of these topics. And I'm going to ask you kind of a big, broad question to send us out. And, my apologies for throwing this your way. So, but I do want to just ask if you could distill down maybe your most valuable piece of advice that you could give listeners who aspire to become engineering leaders or who aspire to succeed in high level positions like your own at massive logos, what would that sound like? What would that look like? Do you have a nugget for us?
Well, first one is especially massive organizations, because some of them I've already touched on. I'll recap them here. But the one we haven't touched on is, in any organization, but especially large ones, there's a lot of politics and stuff like that. Just stay away from it. There's nothing good that's going to come of that. assume everybody has good intent and try to understand why they're saying and doing what they're doing, because usually there is a reason, and then help address that. To become a leader and be successful, intellectual curiosity, trying to understand the customer problem you're trying to solve, because in the end, we all want to win. And the way you win is by creating products people love. Then all the rest of the stuff happens on their own. And, listen to your team, be people focused. You can be the best engineer in the world, and if you're not people focused, you're going to fail.
That's so true, and I think such an often overlooked aspect of what it means to be, at the end of the day, a people leader, not just a tech
And
leader.
I think, I guess one last thing,
Sure.
give back, right? Once you do become a leader, you got there because usually somebody helped you. You got to help bring the next generation along. That was really, I was fortunate in where I started out at. That was something that was taught to me early on. I don't know that gets mentioned enough. You got to give back. You got to help bring the next generation. You're responsible. And at some level, one of the biggest things that I'm disappointed in me and my generation in is that when I started in the software development business, about 30% of our teams were women. For whatever reason, we've created an environment where we've chased them away. You're lucky if you got 15 to 20 these days. We got to do something to fix that. And also, how do we get more minorities into that? So those are things that I'm very passionate about, and we participate in programs with local colleges to help do something about.
That's a great call out. And yeah, I guess I'm surprised to hear that it's gone from 30% down instead of up.
Yeah. Well, you can blame that on us. I own that one. I have 2 daughters, so we got to do something about that.
Right. And I know there's a lot of really great women in STEM programs out there, and even charities and foundations. So definitely top of mind. Something that we feel is very important at QA Wolf as well, and try to practice that as much as possible. I cannot thank you enough for your time, Eric. Thank you so much for sitting down with me, chatting with me. It's been such a pleasure. And I look forward to continuing to watch your career and see where you go next.
All right. Well, thank you for your help, taking the time to talk to me.
My pleasure. All right, everybody. We'll catch you next time.